Good morning and happy June 25th to you. I'm Matt Rudin, filling in for Eric here this morning. He'll be back and rejoining you all next week. But we do have, I think there's a lot to talk about. I want to talk about the storm complex that we're looking at right now. I think there's a lot of pivot points or forks in the road in the forecast going out into July. We're kind of coming at this point that we often get to as we go through into June, where I think the summer pattern starts to reveal itself a little bit more. Certainly going into what are very pivotal weeks at the end of July in terms of agriculture, especially in the central U.S., but some other areas as well. So I want to talk about that. I think there's some inclinations of where we're going in early July, and we'll have to see if that extends out into the future. So we'll take a look there. I do want to cover the storm complex that's moving through the northern Midwest as we speak right now, and that's what we're looking at. Really the last 12 hours of radar evolution across parts of Wisconsin, western Michigan. What we're seeing here is something we call, as meteorologists, an MCS, or mesoscale convective system here. You can see this peaked in intensity almost over Lake Michigan here, which I think is fortunate because, right, people don't, unless there's boats out here at 3 a.m., right, we don't have folks living there. But it did come through parts of western Michigan, still pushing through northern Indiana and northwest Ohio here. You can see that classic bow echo, right? It looks like an archer's bow moving through parts of southern and south central Michigan. And kind of the leading edge or the apex of that bow, which I can kind of track it here on radar, is where we typically see the strongest winds. Now, fortunately, overnight last night, we didn't see a ton of severe weather reports or wind damage reports out of this. I think there's a few reasons for that. One, it's overnight. So folks are sleeping. If the damage wasn't bad enough, perhaps it didn't wake people up, and we'll have to get some sunshine or some morning light and people's eyes on some of the damage to get more of those reports to filter in. So it might be a little bit stronger than advertised. The kind of second thing that I already mentioned, it was over Lake Michigan for about kind of half its life there. So obviously less damage reports there unless you're on a sailboat or something like that. And then again, it might be a little bit less strong than it looks right now on radar, which would be good news for some of the folks up there. Now, I mentioned the severe weather risk. A bigger component, I think, as far as agricultural meteorology is concerned, is this storm system, as you can see it now, pushing through northern Illinois, pushing through northern Indiana, and I'll include Ohio, is marching toward an area in the eastern Cornbelt we need water. We had some rain come through on Saturday, certainly in Indiana, parts of western Ohio, but half an inch to an inch of rain isn't going to fix some of the soil moisture deficits that we've seen built up there, and especially given some of the heat we've seen lately. There's some areas, it's just in Indiana where folks were asking, when's the next rain? When's the next rain? We'll have to watch this storm complex, see how far south it shifts, and we'll talk about that in just a few slides here. This is looking at the radar estimated rainfall over the last 24 hours, and you can really see how big of a swath that this MCS put down rainfall through the northern Midwest. We talk about the severe potential of these storm systems all the time. Of course, if they're strong enough, we call them derechos, and those can have wide-reaching and damaging impacts. But they are a big budget of our rainfall in the Corn Belt in June and July. So we're in that prime MCS time, and the northern Midwest is kind of the derecho or bow echo alley, if you will. So this is all kind of, the stars are aligning. This is when we typically see these storm systems come through, and we see a lot of the rainfall from them. So it's kind of right on time, if you will. The question is, how far south does this push here through the day today into some areas that really need the rainfall? Take that recent precipitation map a little bit further back over the last week. You can see we've talked about it, I think, enough at this point, but the northern Midwest has just been extremely wet, even over the last kind of 30 days as well. I was just up in Sioux Falls and southern Minnesota, unfortunately, last week, and even before we saw the flooding move through there, if you could ask me to paint an area of the Corn Belt that didn't need more water, I'd probably paint this area here, which is almost exactly where we got way too much. I mean, we're talking, in excess of 15 inches in some of these locations over a relatively short period of time. So it's really unfortunate. Just kind of a terrible coincidence that this area that was already very wet, that already had, planting and pre-event plant issues, has gotten even more water here. And unfortunately, just yesterday saw a almost, potential emergency in Mankato, Minnesota, as the Rapidan Dam partially failed there. Flash flood warnings still out for their flood warnings as well. And fortunately, it seems potentially that the Minnesota River there has crested or is very close to cresting. I haven't seen any indications that the dam has outright failed yet, which would drastically increase the level of concern there. So hopefully trending down on the emergency scale there. But that's certainly a situation that we'll have to watch closely even through today, as the river, I think, technically is still rising, albeit slowly at this point. Another area that we've been watching is the Four Corners region. Some of our seasonal forecasts earlier this year suggested maybe a weaker start or a weaker peak monsoon season, and we haven't seen that. We've seen kind of a fast start here. A lot of this thunderstorm and shower activity here was actually influenced and sourced from Tropical Storm Alberto, which developed way down here in the Bay of Campeche and the Gulf of Mexico and actually pushed northwest. Curious enough, I'll change my color bar a little bit, make that a little bit more visible. So we saw that thunderstorm shower activity here, and really we even saw, you can see these little swaths here, some thunderstorm activity in parts of the Central Valley of California on the foothills of the Sierra Nevadas. And it's likely that even the moisture that helped spawn these thunderstorms was connected to Tropical Storm Alberto, which last week was a conversation that we were having in the Atlantic. So it just gives you an example of kind of the far-reaching impacts of the atmosphere and how these storm complexes can change the forecast, even for areas, hundreds of miles away from where they're developing. I think this is a map Eric showed you yesterday. This is looking at the flood gauges across the northern Midwest and really kind of where you would expect to see some of the concern here right over a lot of that rainfall that just fell is where we're seeing the moderate and major flood stages from some of these river gauges here. I mentioned Mankato, that's right here. You can see I mentioned the expectation of that cresting here as we go through the day today, and hopefully that situation lessening as we go out toward the weekend here, and the emergency concern kind of weakening as well. But a lot of water has fallen up here now, making its way into the rivers, including the northern Mississippi River as well. We want to take one closer look at this MCS now moving through parts of northern, even what you might be able to call central Illinois, continuing to see rainfall, still going through northern India, still getting through northwest Ohio. If you look closely at the reflectivity values, which gives us an intensity on how hard that rain is falling, they're starting to weaken a bit, especially in parts of maybe northeast Indiana, northwest Ohio. So the storm system is weakening. That is the expectation as we go forward. If I jump over and look at the HER model run here, make this valid as of Tuesday morning, see that line positioned here across parts of northeast Illinois, northern Indiana. As we go through the day toward the lunch hour today, a weakening in that activity, but still seeing rain falling in parts of eastern Indiana, western Ohio, parts of north central Ohio here. We also see potential, and the HER is just one model run. They can have a lot of difficulties figuring out these kind of thunderstorm complexes where they're going to put down a boundary that might be able to refire storms on it later in the afternoon. So especially this time of year, can never take these models for gospel in terms of where these thunderstorms blow up or how intense they're going to be, but they gives us an idea of at least one way they might evolve. And we're seeing it put down a boundary here in parts of western Indiana, east central Illinois, which could serve as a renewed area of development later today for thunderstorms. I think folks kind of in this area where I've seen a lot of dry fields are looking for rainfall. So if we can avoid some severe weather reports from this, which aren't expected to be too concerning here today, could see another chance for rainfall even as that storm system weakens that's moving through northern Indiana right now. If we take this forecast into Tuesday evening, we are expecting storm systems to develop in parts of southern Iowa, parts of eastern or southeastern Iowa as well. You can see renewed development here across northern Illinois, even parts of southern Illinois and Indiana as well as we go through this evening, and a wider swath of buoyant rain pushing through southern Illinois and southern Indiana. Take this forecast a little bit back, even seeing some development along the Missouri River here in western Iowa, southeast South Dakota, eastern Nebraska, overnight tonight. So even getting out kind of into Wednesday morning. If I take that forecast out into the future, can even see some light rain chances going through the day on Wednesday for folks in eastern Illinois, Indiana, northwest Ohio here. So some multiple chances in the eastern Cornbelt for rain. We have the current system now that's weakening, and I can take you back to show you that system again, weakening today, but likely to bring a swath of rain to northwest Ohio. The northern half of Indiana is what I'll say right now. Weakening through the day today, likely decreasing in coverage through parts of southern Ohio, but potentially seeing renewed thunderstorm development in this area here, which could help push some rain through southern Indiana or parts of central Indiana and parts of central Illinois. And then potentially even as we go in through the day Wednesday, another chance for at least light rain with lighter coverage here for parts of the eastern Corn Belt as the system finally makes its way out of the area. Jump over and look at the Storm Prediction Center. They have a slight risk, a pretty large swath of the slight risk area here across parts of the central and western Corn Belt. I mentioned the potential this evening for storms to fire along the Missouri River. They're tracking that area here. Southern Iowa will include in that as well. I mentioned the possibility that renewed activity could form here in parts of central, eastern Illinois, western Indiana, pushing through the southern part of the state. And then, we have that immediate, right, not a forecast, right? We have severe warned storms here on the leading edge of that weakening storm system here across parts of Illinois and Indiana. It's likely to continue pushing at least for a bit as we go toward the lunch hour through parts of eastern Indiana and western Ohio. So a lot going on here. There's implications in terms of severe weather and rainfall. Slight risk, we're 2 out of 5, right, on the Storm Prediction Center scale. So not the biggest severe weather day, but given just how large and how many states are included here, there's a lot of chances for just an individual storm or two to overperform and maybe cause some more damage than expected. So at least keep an eye out. You're not totally out of the woods here in terms of severe weather, just in terms of hail, wind, and can't rule out a tornado, maybe in Iowa today. Get a little bit different forecast here. This is the 3-kilometer NAM. I don't think it'll be updated as of this point. We'll see how far this forecast takes us. So we do have a good model run. Good. I was hoping to see a little bit different of an opinion here. This is, again, like I said, the 3-kilometer NAM high-resolution model. You can see the storm systems moving through northern Indiana, weakening in that intensity toward the lunch hour today. But we want to watch that boundary that it's lying down here across central Indiana and Illinois for renewed thunderstorm activity. And we do see that. Tuesday evening here, getting towards sunset, renewed activity close to I-80, northern Illinois, northwest Indiana, all the way over into southern Iowa, perhaps near Des Moines. And then we can also see that potential thunderstorm development in southern South Dakota and eastern Nebraska. So again, a little bit different of an evolution here, with the storm systems forming a little bit closer to that kind of sunset hour here, and then pushing south across northern Missouri, through southern Illinois, through southern Indiana, with some light stratiform rain on the backside of this as well. So I mentioned before, these high-resolution models, they are not great this time of year at resolving the individual development of these thunderstorms. We can't take any of these model runs for gospel, but we are seeing this kind of agreement and this multiple round chance for storm systems today across the central and eastern Cornbelt. And this does go a little bit out into Wednesday, and you can see some of that light rain that we are expecting now through the day of Wednesday. Not going to be terribly too much, but at least, right, we're not adding another hot, windy day after some rainfall to zap away all the moisture that we did get, which I think is good news. And then finally, just looking at the ECMWF across the Corn Belt here over the next 72 hours. And I think we see good agreement here. Southern South Dakota, maybe even eastern South Dakota, areas that probably aren't looking for rainfall. Eastern Nebraska, parts of southwestern Iowa, parts of central Illinois receiving anywhere from half an inch to potentially, under some of these stronger thunderstorms, there we go, getting up over an inch of rainfall, including Indiana and that same activity, and Ohio. So areas that need the rainfall in the eastern Corn Belt look likely to receive some appreciable rainfall here over the next kind of 48 to 72 hours, which I think is good news. I've mentioned it before. This is a time of low predictability, especially with thunderstorms. So there will be some hit and miss spots. You can even see some of these kind of popping out here, at least from the ECMWF. It's impossible to predict these in advance. It really is. So unfortunately, some of these areas, we'll just have to kind of see how things shakes out. But on the broad scale, I think some good news for folks in the eastern Corn Belt with kind of an attached severe threat we'll have to keep an eye on. If we jump over and look at the drought monitor updated as of last Thursday, we can see that dryness building in across parts of the eastern Corn Belt. Unfortunately, seeing some dryness here now get into parts of the southeast, the North Carolinas, the Virginia, and the coastal plain there. Been tracking the kind of lessening drought in Florida. We see some drought in the American Southwest. This has been improved a lot by that moisture that we just talked about from Tropical Storm Alberto. We are seeing some rain in the forecast potentially for the high plains east of the Divide. I think that's good news for folks that have been pretty dry here east of the Continental Divide and the Northwest U.S. If we look at the NWS All Hazards map, the latest from NOAA here, you can see the big story right now, at least on the all hazards. One is the flooding that we're still tracking up in the Northwest Corn Belt, but also seeing heat advisories build in across the country here from the San Joaquin Valley in California through the Southern Plains and through what we'll call the Arcola-Miss area, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and the Arklatex, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas area, all the way up through Kansas, Missouri, eastern Nebraska, where unfortunately we're seeing excessive heat warnings along the Mississippi, or I should say the Missouri River Valley. This is really kind of a product of the jet stream, which has been inching further and further toward the north. That has allowed heat to build in underneath that over the central U.S. We saw, heat waves last week, the week before that. I think we're going to continue to see kind of this oscillation of the ridge and the heat concern from the southeast to the central plains over the next week or two. And we'll have to track that as we get out into the forecast here. We jump up and look above, where is the jet stream right now here this morning on Tuesday morning, and where is it going in the future? Well, right now it's north, up near Winnipeg, north of the Great Lakes even, and it's for that reason we're seeing that thunderstorm complex weaken as it gets into the Cornbelt, because we're just losing that influence from the jet stream. I mentioned the Storm Prediction Center has that slight risk out for the Cornbelt here today with that wide swath. The reason likely that it's not even stronger on a higher kind of magnitude there is, again, we don't have that wind shear at that same level of magnitude because that jet stream is inching further north. We do see a ridge here across parts of the southwest here today. I mentioned those heat advisories in the San Joaquin Valley of California, a result of that. I want to take that forecast out into the future. That's going to be pivotal in terms of where the heat's going to set up, where the rainfall is going to come, where the drought risk will continue. If I make this valid as of this morning on Tuesday, we can see that's centered over the southwest. We just talked about that and saw that. We see kind of the primary branch of the jet stream further toward the north over southern Canada. I'll take this forecast into the future. We'll take it through Tuesday evening, finally into Wednesday afternoon, and we can see it has shifted a little bit from the southwest toward the Front Range. And the heat will shift with that more so over the central United States. And that's why you saw those heat advisories positioned there where they were. Take the forecast into Thursday and Thursday morning now. You can see that ridge centered more over Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, the same areas that we just noted underneath those heat advisories. So kind of this increasing warm trend as we go through the week here from Tuesday into Thursday. The other big weather maker here, moving through the northwest, this trough here moving through the Pacific Northwest. This is going to keep going further toward the east of the divide, and bring renewed shower and thunderstorm development across the northern Midwest that we'll have to track. Another thing that really stands out to me on this map here of these height anomalies, and I think is very important in terms of what we've seen in the forecast and where we're going into the future, look at all the troughing that we see over the Hudson Bay, over Ontario, and Quebec, Canada. This is a long wave trough. I think it is connected to some of the warmth that we've seen. Eric has talked about this in the sea surface temperatures and this upper level ridging here in the North Atlantic. What goes down in the atmosphere comes up, and vice versa. So we see a lot of this ridging and the warm ocean temperatures here. I think that's helping to influence troughing over Canada. And that has increased the jet stream gradient, that flow here across parts of the upper Midwest and the northern plains. This is an area here where we've seen renewed kind of activity here just this past Saturday, right, with some storm complexes coming through southern Wisconsin. We saw the tornado report in Janesville, finally got rain into Indiana. If this kind of big bowling ball, if you will, keeps spinning counterclockwise here in Canada, it's going to allow little waves to come out through the northern Midwest, maybe even getting into the eastern Corn Belt, and we'll keep this area wet into the future. So keep an eye on that area. That's where I'm watching closely as this trough comes through Thursday into Friday, likely bringing renewed thunderstorm and shower activity, like I said, through the Midwest as we go through the end of the week here. As that exits to the east, we see renewed ridging develop over parts of the west. We do see this kind of squashed ridge over the south and the southeast, likely to keep the heat around into the southern kind of half of the country here as we get toward the weekend. But we see that bigger ridge now moving over the Front Range again as that trough exits to the east. But keep an eye on Canada. We still have that long wave trough here kind of oscillating or shifting around. It sometimes moves in kind of that orientation here. So we'll have to keep a close eye on that. We see another storm system trying to come out, or a trough, I should say, out of the northwest next week. All is to say there's still momentum in the atmosphere. We're seeing these ridges develop, and there's going to be heat risk certainly over the next 7 to 10 days in this area here, but it's shifting it. It's moving a bit west, and then it moves a bit east, and we have another complex and trough now moving into the northwest. And as I take this forecast even out into next week, which is a little bit further right than our confidence is going to stretch, but we still see that long wave troughing over Canada, helping to bring the jet stream back to parts of the northern Midwest, potentially getting some complexes in through the central and eastern Corn Belt. But we do see that ridge now positioned over the southeast. All's to say, heat risk across the southern portion of the country, if centered anywhere perhaps over the southern plains and parts of the southeast, continuing to see activity through the northern Midwest, potentially getting into the eastern Corn Belt, as long as this trough sticks around up here, helping to focus the jet stream level flow right into Minnesota and Wisconsin. That was a lot. We talked about a lot there. What does this look like in terms of precipitation over the next few days? Well, let's take this ECMWF forecast through the day today. We talked about the weakening storm system over Indiana. We talked about overnight development of storms across Iowa, parts of eastern Nebraska, getting into northern Illinois. Those moving through overnight tonight into Wednesday morning. Talked about potentially on Wednesday some backside precipitation moving through parts of the central and eastern Corn Belt, bringing a renewed chance of rainfall there. And then as we go through the day on Thursday, Can see renewed activity off the continental divide, potentially getting into the plains here, more so certainly on Thursday and Thursday evening as that trough really kind of kicks out across the Pacific Northwest. All the while, we're still seeing that kind of monsoon activity over the Four Corners region, likely in part thanks to some remnant moisture from Alberto. So take this forecast through Friday. We see that storm activity now moving east across the northern plains. This forecast here from the ECMWF, you can't put too much weight on this. Again, these are individual thunderstorms likely trying to resolve here, but we do see some activity here over eastern Iowa, Missouri, and parts of Illinois. I take that forecast even into this weekend now, the activity moving into parts of Ontario, parts of the eastern Cornbelt, maybe even the mid-Atlantic region, and then some questionable activity getting in here across the southeast. I'm not confident that we'll see widespread precipitation out of this. Unfortunately, just it's too far south of that jet stream right now. If I take the forecast into Sunday of next week, again, some kind of boundary likely to be lingering around this area. Unfortunately, we've seen these underperform at times, but it could be a way to get some precipitation into some areas that are starved for it here across the mid-Atlantic, parts of the Carolinas, and the mid-South. I mentioned that storm system potentially coming out of the northwest next week. You can see that activity starting out Monday evening and then potentially pushing through the northern Midwest on Tuesday. We'll have to see if that gets into the eastern Corn Belt or not as we go through the work week next week. Just too far out in the forecast right now. It's Tuesday this week. We're talking about an 8-day forecast next week, but there is the potential for yet another trough to move through this area here as we go through the work week next week. I did want to show you this is precipitable water anomalies, the forecast from the ECMWF. This is looking at total moisture in the atmosphere and how that deviates from normal. I'll make this valid as of Tuesday morning. You can see this big area of higher moisture. Again, that's likely the remnants of Tropical Storm Alberto positioned here across the American Southwest. So take this forecast into the future here. You'll see that trough help to bring more moisture into parts of the high plains here. We've talked about that. And then as that pushes east across the upper Midwest on Thursday, and then into Friday, helping renew storm chances over the weekend for parts of the eastern Corn Belt. What I want to do is take this forecast out into the future. And what you can see here is this continual push of Atlantic moisture into parts of the Southwest, and that's really going to increase and kind of continue that monsoon activity over the Four Corners region, at least even out into next week as well. You can just see these surges of moisture coming out of the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic, and that's actually one way to get some moisture into the Southwest monsoon. We're certainly seeing that evolution here over the next kind of 7 to 10 days. One reason for that, the National Hurricane Center, we've already seen kind of a little bit of an active start to the hurricane season here, what's likely to be a rather busy one, potentially seeing more development in the Bay of Campeche over the next 7 days. And this doesn't look too likely to form anything too significant, but it will bring renewed moisture and renewed surge of that Gulf of Mexico moisture into the desert Southwest. So we are expecting more kind of shower and thunderstorm activities over that region and what's a fast start to the monsoon season there here at the end of June. You can actually see this if you look closely. This is looking at 850 millibar winds, so kind of about a mile up in the atmosphere. And you'll notice there's just kind of this push of trade wind activity all the way up into the desert Southwest. As I play this forecast into the future, just kind of see that connection here all the way from the Atlantic into the desert Southwest. There's that thunderstorm complex potentially developing in the Bay of Campeche that the National Hurricane Center is keeping an eye on. But perhaps the bigger story here is just the moisture surge getting all the way up into parts of eastern Mexico, southern Texas, and then eventually helping to fuel the monsoon there. If we just look at the next 10 days of rainfall anomalies, this from the ECMWF here, you can see this area of focus here that we're expecting across parts of the central Corn Belt, maybe even the east central Corn Belt from the thunderstorm complex is not only here this afternoon, potentially tomorrow, potentially getting toward this weekend as well. You can also see that desert Southwest monsoon that we were just talking about because of that moisture connection from the Atlantic that we talked about. A little bit different of a forecast. This is from the GFS model, their 10-day forecast precip anomalies. Pretty similar look here across parts of the central and eastern Corn Belt. You can see that similar look here for the Southwest monsoon. The GFS may be more so than some other models, trying to get some kind of scattered thunderstorm development in across the southeast and the Carolinas, South Carolina. Not totally confident in this right now. I mentioned we're likely going to see that ridge kind of shifting west to east across this area. As it shifts east, that could allow some thunderstorms to develop here in the southern plains. This is an area that we've been tracking that has been dry. It has had some rain here recently, fortunately. That would keep areas of the southeast dry. As it shifts back to the west, that could allow some more thunderstorm complexes to get into the southeastern U.S. So we'll have to watch that kind of shifting back and forth, I think, over the next few weeks to see where that rainfall does develop and what's beginning to be a pretty dry area there. Take a look at the 5-day temperature anomalies, also from the European model. We see this kind of bullseye here over the southern plains. It's an area we're concerned about, and also an area where we saw those heat advisories. We do see continued heat across the southeast. Cooler, more seasonal conditions underneath some of that thunderstorm activity in the northern parts of the Cornbelt and New England. If I take this forecast out a little bit further into the future, this is the 5 to 10-day anomalies. Don't see a huge shift, unfortunately, again in the heat here. So this kind of squashed ridge, which is trying to move back and forth a little bit, keeping this area, unfortunately, warmer and certainly at the kind of peak heating part of the year, hotter than normal, and just decreased precipitation and thunderstorms likely as a result. This is from the ECMWF AIFS, a little bit different of a forecast, but want to look at it in terms of where we're going in the long range in terms of that ridge forecast that we just talked about. This is, through the lunch hour on Tuesday here today. See that ridge kind of positioned over parts of the southwest and the Four Corners region. So I take this through into Wednesday, into Thursday. There's that trough that we talked about pushing off the continental divide on Thursday evening. See this ridge kind of weakened here across parts of the mid-south. Pushing more toward the southeast as we go into Friday afternoon and evening, keeping the heat in that area here. As that trough moves through, you can see that little bit of a shift over toward the southern plains, that likely bringing heat back at the end of the weekend up through the central U.S., the southern plains, into parts of the central and northern plains as well, as that trough moves to the east, which will be another chance potentially to try to sneak and convince some thunderstorms to move down here through North Carolina and maybe even into Tennessee. We'll see. Not a lot of confidence right now in that forecast, but with that ridge shifting back toward the west, it does open up that corridor again for some potential activity. So take this forecast into Tuesday and then Wednesday of next week. We can see that next trough that's trying to push through that we talked about. The forecast right now keeping this a little bit further toward the north, which would probably keep the eastern Corn Belt a little bit more dry. We'll have to see. This is far enough out in the forecast that there's some uncertainty regarding the evolution here. But again, if we look at that southeast U.S. ridge, we can see it's still positioned here across maybe Tupelo, Mississippi, Chattanooga. This area here likely seeing reduced precip and rainfall as we go out into the work week next week. So unfortunately, an area that's dry, likely to continue to stay dry through the next week. As a result, the Climate Prediction Center, their temperature outlook for July 2nd to the 8th, getting out into next week, almost toward next weekend, kind of based on the forecast that we just talked about, right? This is an area that we'd probably circle for in heat risk, and that's exactly where the Climate Prediction Center has placed their above average likelihood for warmer temperatures, and then parts of California seeing that as well. With the southwest monsoon kind of reinvigorated here in the early part of that season, temperatures a little bit less. So this looks a little bit different than maybe what we were expecting a little bit earlier this year in terms of where the exact kind of highest heat impacts are. But certainly a level of concern building here across parts of the southeast. And the reason for that, not just hot, but an area of reduced precipitation, unfortunately, across parts of the far south and potentially getting into the mid-south. With that ridge setting up somewhere here, we can follow ridge riding thunderstorms around that. So we see the renewed activity on the monsoon on the western side of that, where that ridge kind of bends back around, seeing renewed thunderstorm activity again in that kind of week 2 time frame across the northern Midwest. Climate Prediction Center may be a little bit more bullish on how much rain is getting into the eastern Corn Belt. Some of those forecast models kept that second wave moving through the upper Midwest, leaving this area a little bit drier. But just given how far out that is in the forecast, I think there's enough uncertainty that could open up, shift a little bit further south, and bring more of the Corn Belt into the precipitation conversation. Another area and thing that we watch closely this time of year are soil moistures, because those can tend to reinforce drought, certainly more directly. They can also influence temperatures at the surface as well, which can also therefore influence some of the positioning of the upper level ridges and how persistent those get in some areas. Now, as I kind of walked you through the forecast there, we looked at the Climate Prediction Center forecast. An area in the southeast was probably, and the southern plains was our biggest concern for ridge development, further heat and water stress. And unfortunately, that's an area where we already see those soil moisture deficits. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling cycle here, where we're dry tends to get a little bit drier, unfortunately, this time of year in the continental U.S. because of what we call sensible heat feedback. An area that we're very wet is in that desert southwest where we've had the monsoon. Certainly the northern Midwest where recycled moisture here from what we call the brown ocean effect. You have wet plants, you have wet soils, that's evaporating air, renewing the moisture in the lowest levels of the atmosphere. As these systems come through, they can put down a little bit more rainfall, keeps this area a little bit cooler. So for that reason, we saw more seasonal or cooler conditions over the next week or two for the upper Midwest and northern Cornbelt. This area here remains an area of concern going into the future, into July, for renewed drought and heat stress. Want to look at a bit longer term forecast. This is from the GFS ensemble here. Kind of two things that stand out to me. This is a 5-day height anomaly map from the GFS looking out toward the end of the next work week. So getting well out into the forecast, can't be too confident, but I see two things here. One, that mid-south, southern plains, southeast ridge. We saw that from the ECMWF-AIFS. We're now seeing it in the GFS as well. We saw the Climate Prediction Center. They're concerned for that same area. We still see this big trough over Canada. And these two combined are going to have a huge gradient between them. We know that helps to fuel the jet stream. So this area here likely to remain wet and stormy, warm certainly in July, but with renewed thunderstorm precipitation chances, maybe even some renewed severe weather development as we start the month of July. Seeing enough forecasts kind of aligning here and agreeing with each other to make that forecast. We have not necessarily seen that forecast from the long-range ECMWF. This is the extended forecast, 30 days all the way out to the beginning of August. And the ECMWF has gone very dry. They've been kind of peculiarly dry out on their own in terms of this forecast, all the way from Houston, maybe even up to Edmonton, Canada, right? Just drying this whole area here and kind of curiously bringing moisture back to the southeast. It is a forecast, I don't want to totally throw it out, but I'm not seeing this right now in the models. It doesn't follow some things we're watching with persistence. One reason I think this goes so dry is that trough I just showed you here over parts of Canada, this anomalous trough here for June and July. It has it exiting, kind of stage left. And so I guess that'd be stage right if you were on the stage of North America. Anyway, not important, but if that exits, right, that allows the jet stream to shift much further north and would help this area get dry. Not seeing that right now in the forecast. This forecast is going out basically as far as, I'd reliably trust some of these signals here and just not seeing that trough exit the area. And as is the case, expecting this corridor to remain wet into July here. I did want to share it, though, as a forecast because it's there, and it is something we might have to watch as a possibility, just not seeing it right now. With that jet stream going well north, because of that trough exiting, we see warmth develop across the entire North American kind of prairie and plain region here. It's hard to get this much north, this much widespread dryness meteorologically across North America and the continental U.S. I won't say it can't happen. It's difficult. A lot of kind of rare things need to occur in sequence for some forecast like this to verify, and just not seeing that right now. So not as concerned about that scenario playing out. Another kind of long-range thing we've been keeping an eye on as I finish up here is El Niño has been weakening this year through April into the end of June here. But you'll notice this trend line has flattened out or stalled ever since we turned the calendar to June. We haven't seen this decrease in ocean temperatures in the Central Pacific. Kind of what we thought more would happen has not occurred. So we are not in a La Nina here at the end of June. And we've actually risen above that 0 degrees Celsius line. Not saying we're going back into an El Nino, certainly, but we've seen this stalling in La Nina conditions. And we've seen forecasts start to adjust for this. So a lot of these forecasts earlier this year looked something like this, where a lot of these members, this kind of spaghetti plot, you will, were down here with a moderate to strong La Nina developing by next winter. Now we've seen these forecast models, they're sticking a lot close to neutral. I would say the majority of them are still in weak La Nina in terms of their forecasts going through fall and into early winter. But there are some now forecasting neutral conditions for this winter. And some of the ones that are in La Nina are in a weak La Nina, if anything else. So this is an interesting development, potentially not as strong of a La Nina developing, and can't rule out that it fails to develop at all. We'll have to see. This could have wide-ranging impacts for the kind of winter forecast, maybe even spring and summer of next year, but far too early to get out into that. If we look at sea surface temperatures right now across the globe, here is that cold water in the eastern Pacific that we've been waiting to push into the central Pacific, which would help us get into a La Nina. And it has just been reluctant to do so. So while this stays over here, we will not be in a La Nina. We have to push that out into the central Pacific. What we have seen is this temperature disparity from the central Pacific with the North Pacific. We think that's likely fueling some of the momentum and the increased strength of the jet stream across this area. And then I mentioned the warmth in the North Atlantic. This warmer sea surface temperature here likely helping to fuel that bowling ball trough I just talked about over Canada. So potentially this heat here helping to keep this trough moving, helping to keep the jet stream level flow, kind of going something like this, pushing through the Northwest at times, diving back through parts of the upper Midwest and the Northeast, keeping this area wetter as we go through July. So a few things working in concert here to keep these things moving and storm systems coming on the horizon. I did want to show you just a kind of far out forecast here. This is from the ECMWF model. It's a seasonal forecast all the way out into October, November, and December. It's as far as it goes. I'm showing this not necessarily as kind of a, hey, definitely believe this forecast. It's just kind of beyond the range of where we would expect it to be that accurate. Curiously enough, the ECMWF is one of those models that has corrected back and showing a very weak and maybe not even a development of La Nina as we go into the kind of early winter period. However, as I say that, their forecast for precipitation here across the continental U.S. and Canada in October, November, December actually looks pretty La Nina-y. So, whether we're in a weak La Nina or a moderate La Nina or INSO neutral, there's still a lot of uncertainty in the winter forecast. So I show this almost just more we have to wait and see how the winter forecast is going to play out. Even kind of a very weak La Nina could have this pretty textbook La Nina-like signature. We're dry in the southern part of the country, dry in the western part of the country, and more wet in the kind of northern third of it. So we'll have to see how that plays out here. I want to touch really quickly at the end here on the global forecast for precipitation from the ECMWF. You can see this 10-day anomaly, seeing the activity here across central Cornbelt, the upper Midwest, potentially getting into parts of the Southwest as well that we discussed, leaving this area dry. Looking at some other areas of the globe, the North China Plain, continuing to see and keep an eye on dryness developing there. Conversely, been very wet in the southern half of the country here. But the Manchurian Plain, north of Korea, is seeing some rainfall activity over the next 10 days. So keeping an eye on that. What has been at times a slow start to the Indian monsoon, at least over the next 10 days, looks to be reinvigorated across the Ganges Plain, parts of western India, and even the southern part of the country as well. So almost wholesale renewed activity in the monsoon. Another area that we'll keep an eye on as we're expecting an active hurricane season is the West African monsoon. It's kind of early in the year for this to be a huge area of interest, but as we go later into July and then into August, we'll be watching this area here as we get more storms here that can fuel these easterly African waves that come out into the tropical Atlantic, into what we'll call the main development region of the Atlantic, where they bubble into early storms that then get on our radar in terms of the National Hurricane Center, where we're tracking them, and could be a potential threat to a U.S. landfall or in the Caribbean as well. That's getting out a little bit further into the forecast, but wanted to make you aware of some of these things that we're watching big picture. That's all I have for y'all here today on this Tuesday morning. Thanks for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later this week.